anti-democratic or non-democratic auspices, such as, for example, the rise of the German.
Could you please pass on the message to your colleagues and friends who are a bit late? We'll try and start on time and stick to the schedule.
Yeah, because the next few days are going to be super packed, we really ought to start as far as possible exactly at the start time, because it'll start pushing
But
things.
these people, you are the ones who are here. If you can pass the message on to anyone in your immediate circle, you know it's coming late. Anyway, that would be grateful. I will be grateful for that. Now we have, yes.
So again, it's, I mean, today is actually a really marquee day for me in this workshop, because it's the first time I actually get to present two people with whom I went to graduate school with. It probably means I'm getting older than I want to be. But so in either case, it's really a great pleasure to have Vamsi Vakulabharanam speaking here today. Vamsi has been associated with the Advanced Graduate Workshop, not just for this, but he's the Akbar equivalent for the summer workshop, or should I say Akbar is his equivalent for the winter workshop. Vamsi is Associate Professor at the University of Hyderabad. Before that, he was at the City University of New York, and he works on a wide range of issues, broadly political economy, but within political economy, he has worked extensively on issues of agrarian distress in India. He has worked on the urban process now in India, and has a wide range of interests. But what he's going to be presenting here today is work that he is doing as an INET scholar. He's one of the first awardees of an INET grant, and is also has also won an award called the Amartya Sen Award, which is an extremely prestigious award in Indian economics. And his work that was funded by INET has to do with a very interesting and I think very critical question, and he will elaborate upon this more, which is how is it that in the two great periods of growth in East Asia, one was more equalizing, rather one was more disequalizing than the other. In the last 20 years, you've seen a lot of disequalizing growth, and that's actually quite it's a large question and an open question. So Vamsi won his award for that, and he presents some of his results. So welcome, Vamsi.
Couple of prefatory remarks. One, I presented something similar last year, and this is actually being written up. What I'm going to present today is being written up as a book this semester. So I'm on leave and I'll be in New York most of this semester writing this book up. The second thing is, just to sort of anticipate the answer, there is no simple, perhaps there is no simple secular, linear or non-linear relationship between development and inequality. However, if you look at contingent explanations, based on patterns of global political economy and also local political economy in different countries, different regions, you may begin to see certain underlying patterns in the last 150 years. So that's the broad story I'm going to narrate. And as I just told you, this is something, as an argument, this is being developed as of now. So feel free to problematize it, raise questions of various kinds and so forth. Okay. My own personal sense from reading the literature on within country inequality is that it has not been very well understood. Okay, so that's the starting point. And I'm going to focus on changes that have occurred in a temporal frame, not cross-sectional kind of analyses, of what happened to inequality, let's say between when you compare poor countries versus rich countries. I'm going to look at within country inequality changes, based on time series data. And I'm not going to present any econometric results. It's also late in the evening for that. Let me just show you some patterns and make broad hypotheses which will be established later. as I write it up. Part of the reason why this question of development and inequality has become relevant, I think, across the globe, but also in the Indian context, is when people look at what has happened in China and India over the last 30-35 years, both these countries have witnessed very high growth, right? And one could interpret this period as early capitalist development for these countries. But at the same time, both countries have witnessed tremendous increases in inequality. Right? This is something that people have observed, and all data sources that we have established this particular result. So there is a temptation to go back to the person who really structured a lot of debates around this question, Kuznets, Simon Kuznets, and there's almost an easy interpretation that this is the first part of the Kuznets curve, and that's I think what is going on in a lot of analyses concerning China and India. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present a slightly different framework, a framework that would disagree with Kuznets, and something that's not part of the mainstream, and but it also brings together, it will attempt to synthesize the Asian story by taking 5 economies. I'll talk about it in a second. So let's look at the prevalent analysis. As I already mentioned, you have the Kuznets curve kind of analysis. I already sent the original article of Kuznets. It's worth reading. The one that he wrote in 1955, which was also his presidential address to the American Economic Association, I think. And if you read the piece, Kuznets doesn't come across as mechanistic or that is making a very simple argument. He's actually very, very careful, and he's saying this is probably what is going on, and he's also saying but we need to look at political economy, explanations for what happened in different countries. I think it's a very rich article, but when it comes to later economists, let me openly make a critical remark about economists. It becomes mechanistic, it becomes simple, and it becomes an inverted U kind of hypothesis that all countries are supposed to follow. I don't think Kuznets, to be fair to him, was making that kind of a simplistic argument. What complicates things further is, because of absence of data, as Suresh was pointing out this afternoon, it's not easy to get good income data on several countries. Especially, for instance, if you go to China, between 1949 and 1978, it's very hard to obtain good income data. Right? Post 78, there are decent data, but during Mao period, it's hard. Although people have come up with some analyses, based on the available data. So what has happened is one kind of confusion that has emerged is what happened in the World Bank. Monte Ahluwalia, who is a very important policy maker in India right now, he started talking about cross-sectional data to interpret dynamic changes, and so this has caused a lot of incoherence in the literature, I think. I think there is a need to go beyond Kuznets curve, and that's what I'm going to present today. As there are 2 broad anomalies that that the Kuznets curve came up against. One anomaly is what happened in the developed world. Right? In the developed world, well, you had the inverted U kind of a story, and post 1970s, incomes rose in the developed world in several countries, but then inequality also began to rise. Right? So this is something that's one anomaly. The second major anomaly is what happened in Asia, as Arjun already pointed out in the introductory remarks. In the period between 1950 and 1980s, roughly, Asian early economic development in Asia was accompanied by equalizing processes, largely. I'll show you some of the data later. And that's the second anomaly. So I wanted to pick up on one of these 2 anomalies and then re-examine this particular relationship. So that's part of the reason why I focus on the Asian experience. The other thing that has happened, once people started seeing problems with Kuznets kind of analysis, well, some people went back and said, well, you could reinterpret Kuznets, if you do other kinds of analyses, you still get Kuznets patterns. But the other response is, economists have given up on that macro relationship between development and inequality, and they've shifted to micro studies. And I think this is something that you would see in a lot of literature. People focus on wealth differences, across individuals, across regions. There's a focus on education or human capital differences across regions, across people, across groups, across classes. These sorts of analyses begin to replace the macro understanding of the relationship between development and inequality.
Just one thing, man.
Yeah.
This is a multidisciplinary group. I presume everybody is familiar with Kuznets hypothesis. If not, maybe we could just, yeah, everyone knows what the Kuznets hypothesis is? Sorry.
Okay. I can explain it in one sentence. Okay.
Multidisciplinary group.
Right. So, the question is, are there possibilities for new economic thinking in this particular theme? And so what I do is I analyze the experiences of 3 East Asian economies, Japan, Korea, and China, 1 Southeast Asian economy, Malaysia, and 1 South Asian economy. So this covers East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and I picked these 5 countries as representatives of this part of Asia. So I don't claim that I'm speaking for other parts of Asia. And I believe that all these different countries, these 5 countries, have had fascinating experiences with inequality. And so the relationship between development and inequality can be investigated by looking at what happened in these 5 countries. And from this, and this is where some questions can be raised, I would like to hypothesize to arrive at a more durable relationship between development and inequality. Okay, so this is the broad narrative of the presentation. So what is the Asian experience? Let me show you a few graphs. If you look at the Japanese story since 1960, this is, by the way, unlike the Kuznets curve, on the x-axis you actually have time. I'll also show you per capita income on the x-axis in a second. But what you actually see is, from 1960s up to almost early 1980s, in Japan you see a decline in inequality. And then post 1980s, you begin to see a rise in inequality. This is the point I was making, the second anomaly in the Asian case. But if you look at the Japanese story over the long run, and replace the x-axis with per capita income, what you actually see is, at low levels of per capita income, the Japanese economy actually witnessed a rise in inequality. This is, if you look at when it happened, this is between 1920s and 1940s, you actually see a rise in inequality. And then, you begin to see a decline after 1940s, and then, again a rise after 1980s. So, yeah. Oh, I got there was okay. So what you see is, initially you could argue that, there's a Kuznets kind of pattern here, but after, Japan achieves a certain level of per capita income, you actually see, a U kind of relationship emerging between per capita income and or development and inequality. The Korean story, we don't have reliable data for the pre-80s period, but what you see about the 80s is that in the early 80s you actually see a decline, almost until 90s. And then post 93, 94, inequality begins to rise in Korea. Once again, you see the U pattern here.
Is this disposable income or pre-tax transfer?
This is pre-tax.
Why is that the right number?
because if you take redistribution into account, actually I looked at both. In fact, I looked at both pre-tax and post-tax, and the patterns are similar. I didn't want to go with one set of numbers. Actually, these numbers are pre-tax, yeah. But I also have the post-tax patterns there.
It seems an odd choice, because we want to know the inequality of living standards.
Sure.
I mean, maybe what you want to know is how the market processes, what happens at the end of the market processes before redistribution, right? Maybe the argument is that it's actually something to do with the nature of accumulation. That's what you want to do.
But we'll come back to that, Sam. But the patterns are similar. There is no big difference. I did look at both the numbers. Yeah.
Just very quickly, the Japanese story, what was the peak due to?
In the period between 1900 and 1930s, Japan was following a particular kind of industrialization where, the zaibatsus were beginning to accumulate. I'll tell the story a little later. But that's the period when you actually see a significant rise in inequality. And post World War II, something happens. That's the story that we'll elaborate on. But we'll come back to that question.
Another one immediate question rises, but you don't have to answer it now. We can maybe take it later. But I thought I should mention. What about this wide claim? Many writing have claimed that the early period of growth in Korea and Taiwan was actually fairly egalitarian. But you're saying there isn't enough adequate data for the.
For Korea, I tried very hard. I was in Seoul. I went to all the agencies. Nobody has data on 60s, 70s. So you have reliable data, household level reliable data only from the 80s.
So that claim is actually.
That claim may be right.
May or may not be right.
Yeah, but no.
There's enough.
Right.
In your view, there isn't enough adequate data for that claim.
Korean scholars say that they don't have data. Well, yeah. If you look at the Malaysian story, it's actually a little more complicated. In the right after independence, between 1958 and 1970, there's a rise in inequality in Malaysia, and then post 1970, inequality begins to decline. And then roughly 1980, 85, 86, around that time inequality begins to rise again in Malaysia, and that's the pattern. So after the initial rise, you also see a broad U pattern in Malaysia. This is both, this has urban, rural as well as the entire country. And a similar story emerges if you look at per capita income. Chinese inequality, as I already mentioned, we do not have data for the pre-78 period, but in terms of what happened in China pre-78, I'll make a couple of remarks later. There are some scholars who have tried to study the patterns of inequality before 78, although there are not adequate data. They look at other kinds of processes and make conclusions. But if you look at the story after 78, what you see is the period between 1978 and roughly mid-80s, inequality actually goes down in China, and this is because again the story will be elaborated later, but the rural-urban gap declines quite significantly during that period, and then inequality-inducing processes are introduced in the Chinese economy post 1978, post 85, 86. The story is similar if you look at, if you change the x-axis again. And the Indian story, we don't, it's not easy to compute what happened to the overall inequality between 1960s and the present. So the overall inequality patterns are presented only from 1983 onwards. But if you look at the rural patterns or urban inequality patterns, what you actually see is a decline in the decades of 50s and 60s, and then there is a rise in inequality in the 70s, and then 80s is broadly equalizing growth. post 91, when India actually embarked on economic reforms, inequality begins to rise steadily, and that's the continuing pattern today. It's not exactly a U pattern, but so there is a slight rise in the middle, and I'll talk about it later. So just to summarize, these various phenomena, what you actually get if you analyze the Asian experience since 1950s is one, it's not entirely homogeneous, but there seem to be strong similarities. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is if there is a pattern, and I think one could argue, with a little bit of stretch that there is a pattern that in these 5 economies, you actually have something like a U-shaped relationship between development and inequality during this period since 1950s. So how do we make sense of this? I think there are certain autonomous processes going on within these countries. But then, this is a relative autonomy. There are some internal processes, changes, dynamics that are occurring within these economies. But there are also changes that are happening in the global economy, primarily emanating from, global capitalist centers. And it is in this interaction, between what is happening in local economy and what is happening across the global economy, it's in this intersection that we can actually find answers for the questions. So let me start with the local political economy of these 5 economies. I'm going to, each of these slides will become a chapter, so it will be a very broad overview. But let me still present, the main sort of story. In the case of Japan, if we stick to this period, maybe in the Q&A session, Himanshu, we can go back to the earlier, the spike in inequality in the earlier period. But if you stick to the post-World War II period, there's a significant decline in the income inequality levels in Japan, whether it is pre-tax or post-tax. And if we can pick either of these and analyze. But one of the things that happened in Japan is, during World War II, the industrial centers were wiped out, were bombed out, right? Tokyo, Osaka, some of the big cities, went through extensive bombing. So, it directly hit the capitalist classes, which were probably extremely wealthy at that point in time. And then, a whole range of reforms happened. I think, if we start with tax reforms, there were, policies that were implemented that directly targeted the rich, and there were also these very significant estate taxes, that led to redistribution. And then you have, this attempt, which partially succeeded, to dissolve the Zaibatsu corporations, these huge conglomerates in Japan, and create, smaller corporations. And this, I think, contributed to a reduction of, the top incomes. Then you have, in the rural areas, and this is an enduring story for East Asia. Most of the East Asian countries also undertook very significant rural land reforms, agricultural land reforms. And there was also conscious agricultural price management, to make sure that, the terms of trade between, agricultural goods, commodities, and non-agricultural commodities did not tilt too much in the favor of non-agricultural commodities. So that's another thing. And you also have an interventionist and broadly progressive state. Interventionist in the sense of, as somebody was raising in the morning, there was an industrial policy, there were various kinds of state-induced policies in place. Post-1980, what happens is, from the available literature, especially, if you want to look at the work of, Ito Makoto, there are a few people who have analyzed the transformation very carefully. There's been, an introduction of various privatization processes. Railways, for instance, was privatized in the early 80s. And, various processes of deregulation happened. And Japan also, after growing rapidly and stably, for about 30 years, between 1950 and 1975, about 25 years, it begins to fluctuate a lot, and within Japan, Japanese capital doesn't find too many avenues for further investment, so it begins to export itself to other countries, especially in Asia, but also US and other countries. This is the time when US economy also feels a threat of Japanese competition. So Japanese capital begins to invest elsewhere. So what it also does is it directly introduces a threat effect on various working groups, unions and so forth, and that begins to have an impact on inequality levels, which rise sharply in the 80s and 90s. The two-tier labor market structure that everybody talks about in the Japanese case, a small section of Japanese workers have permanent employment, but a large section of Japanese workers have joined the ranks of contract employment, and that's something that deepens in the late 80s, from the late 80s onwards, and it continues until today.
Roughly what are the proportions?
I think from what I recall, I think 40% of the total Japanese workers are in the contract labor case. That's what I recall, but I need to check the number. I can't recall. Yeah. Then you have financialization. The Plaza Accords, also led to massive asset booms in the late 80s, and early 90s. Japanese economy goes through a crash, and it has never fully recovered. But the processes of inequality, inequality inducing changes in Japan, I think these processes began to become deeper. They continue through the 90s and 2000s, and they heighten actually. In the early 2000s when Koizumi regime comes to power, and the current regime too, I think is fairly against progressive redistribution. The Korean case, while there's no clear data, there are various arguments, as Akbar was pointing out, that 60s and 70s also witnessed equalizing growth. But it's not clear what data they are actually using. But if it's not clear, nobody knows. In fact, in Korea, you go to several income distribution institutes. They say that nobody has access to any of that data. But one could posit that certain important changes, structural changes happened in the 60s in Korea. One is again, as I said, enduring case of land reforms, and equalization in rural areas. I think that's something that is true for most East Asian economies. And then there is also, unlike in the Indian case over the last 20 years, there's a massive increase in urban employment. As growth, industrial growth created, a labor-intensive model of industrial growth created lots of new jobs. And in the 1980s, when we actually see a decline in inequality, that's primarily because the labor movement in Korea became very progressive and very militant, and they actually begin to push for progressive redistributions. But through the entire period, again the rural-urban gap was kept low, and as in the Japanese case, you also saw an interventionist state through the whole process. There have been several interesting analyses of these processes, Alice Amsden's work, but there have been several other analyses that point out these things. But once you come into the 90s,
you also have rising real wages.
Yes, yes, through the whole period, even 60s, 70s, but 80s, the labor movement becomes militant and progressive. Since 90s, what you actually see is, in the 60s, you really didn't have a capitalist class in Korea, but between 60s and 80s, even if it was equalizing, the capitalist class emerged, and there was a strengthening of, these conglomerates, Korean industrial conglomerates called chaebols. And chaebols, begin to call the shots, and I think they start playing a key role. And like in the Japanese case, and this is something that Korean scholars have worked upon, and also people like Jim Crotty at UMass Amherst, have worked upon. There's been significant deregulation. You also see the emergence of a two-tier labor market. And Korean economists argue that this is skill-biased technical change, but a lot of progressive economists from Korea and elsewhere argue that there have been active attacks on the labor movement since 90s. And there is also the formation of a class enclave. I think this is a story that emerges in Korea, in China, and also in India, as I'll show. There's a class enclave that emerges since 90s, which actually begins to corner most of the gains from growth. And this is a story that I have worked upon for both Chinese and Indian stories carefully. If you look at the Malaysian case, the Southeast Asian representative, right after independence, the British ensured that most of the policies that they followed, were continued, in independent Malaysia. So actually, the Malaysian regime that comes into effect, it doesn't come out of a deep, independence movement like in the Indian case, or a revolutionary movement like in China. It actually is almost a bloodless kind of transition of power. And laissez-faire policies that actually existed during the British time continued, after 1958, and then the primary characterization of inequality, if you look at the literature, or again, for this period there is no clear data, even with the Malaysian, planning unit, which actually controls all the data. But published data actually show that the inequality among different ethnic communities was quite severe. So the Malay people who constituted the majority in Malaysia, they were actually the poorest as a community. The Indian community was a little better than the Malay community. The Chinese community was the most affluent. So that was the hierarchy among the ethnic communities, and the inter-ethnic inequality was fairly significant during that period. This actually, the story is that this led to very significant riots in the late 1960s between the Chinese and the Malay people especially. And then you actually see the introduction of what is known as the new economic policy, NEP, which starts somewhere in the early 70s and it continues until today, but it undergoes significant transformations in the 1980s. So this, by late 80s, you actually see a decline in inequality under the impact of the new economic policy. And this is primarily because the inter-ethnic component, inter-ethnic inequality actually begins to decline quite significantly. And post-90s, inequality begins to rise again. And the story here is, during the new economic policy, in the first 15 years of the working of the new economic policy, a Malay rich class consolidates itself. And so the story of rising inequality is one of rising intra-ethnic inequality after 90s. Within Malay community, within the Chinese community, within the Indian community, you actually see a rise in inequality. So it becomes a class story. Malaysia is a very divided society ethnically, but I think it becomes a class story. If you begin to carefully analyze. And you also see the introduction of neoliberal economic policy. Similar things that happen in Japan and Korea also happen in the Malaysian case, and the rural-urban gap also begins to shoot up. Let me run through the Chinese and Indian cases quickly. So if you come to the Chinese case, probably between 1952, based on the existing analysis, between 1952 and 1978, overall inequality fell, primarily because urban, within urban inequality fell very significantly. Wages were equalized during Mao's regime, and within commune inequality in rural areas, because rural agricultural production was conducted, and non-agricultural production too in rural areas was conducted primarily in village communes, and within commune inequality actually declined quite significantly. But there were two other sources of inequality in Mao's China. One is the between commune inequality, communes that existed in fertile regions vis-a-vis communes that existed in that were working in less fertile regions. The other source of major inequality in Mao's China is rural-urban gap. Rural areas were much poorer compared to the urban spaces. I think these two inequalities were not corrected during the Mao period. The reforms after 1978, the initial reforms, led to a spurt in agricultural growth. So this causes rural-urban gap to decline. Terms of trade actually shift in favor of agriculture in the first 6 years after reforms especially. That reduces the overall inequality. What happens since late 80s until the present is that once again, there is a consolidation within the local political economy. There is a consolidation of the political class that was dominant, and they begin to enter businesses in a big way. And there's also an indigenous development of a capitalist class, of people who do well in rural communes, migrate to urban spaces. But it's primarily the political class that calls the shots, and that consolidates until mid-80s. Post-90s, you actually see post-1992, in fact, in response to hyperinflation, China actually moves into a completely different regime. The processes of accumulation by disposition, where peasants are kicked out of their their lands, or restructuring of state-owned enterprises, like large-scale retrenchments start to happen in Chinese enterprises, and there's also a massive low-wage kind of migration. That's the story that we read about when you think about China. And so the capital-labor balance, one could argue that there is a significant capitalist class, whether it's a combination of foreign capital as well as indigenous capital, or even if you focus only on indigenous capital. But the capital-labor balance shifts quite considerably, after mid-90s. And in terms of the rural-urban gap, it's at a historical high. I think historically unprecedented. It's around 4. The average urban Chinese, earns 4 times as much as the average rural Chinese. The Indian case, I think there was an overall declining trend. As I said, in the 70s, you actually see a spike in, a mild increase in inequality in the Indian case. That's mainly because of 2 phenomena. One is, the introduction of green revolution, in certain pockets of the country, which leads to, some farmers, becoming much richer than other farmers, and some regions actually, agricultural regions becoming richer than other regions. And there's also an industrial stagnation between 1965 and late 70s. But 1980s actually sees a great recovery. Growth picks up quite significantly compared to the first 30 years of independence, and then you also see incomes of all classes rising during the 80s. It was broad-based growth. All that changes in the 90s. There's a consolidation of a class enclave, like I mentioned in the Korean case, and one of the key phenomena that we observed in the Indian case is that there is a phenomenon of agrarian distress, and which manifests in large-scale farmer suicides. And this is what actually Arjun was mentioning. My dissertation was about that. What happened? What happened to agriculture? And that's where Indian majority is still housed. So this is something that happens very significantly. Services and industry, these 2 sectors grow rapidly, but they don't create enough employment. And agriculture, which has the majority, actually slows down considerably after mid-90s. And there's also some increase in the pace of migration after mid-90s, especially in the 2000s. And this migration from rural areas to urban areas is primarily going into low-wage informal markets, right? So that also contributes to a heightening of urban inequality. So these are the various local political economies. This is what actually Arjun was mentioning. My dissertation was about that. What happened? What happened to agriculture? And that's where Indian majority is still housed. So this is something that happens very significantly. Services, and then post 1950s, there's a decline in inequality, and that continues until late 1970s, and then there's a continuous rise in inequality in the UK. If you look at the US story, again you see a similar pattern. There's a Kuznets kind of pattern until 1940s, and then you begin to see an increase in the inequality patterns inequality levels after mid 1970s. So the story that I am actually constructing for the Asian economies, the 5 Asian economies that I looked at, is not a story of exceptionalism. It actually fits with what unfolds in the developed world too. So now how do we sort of connect the local political economy stories with the global political economy story? And this is where we have to bring in a couple of categories, from 2 schools of thought, which were developed in France and the US. And interestingly, one person who was associated with both these schools of thought is with us. Sam, worked with the regulation school. Sam also worked with social structures of accumulation. These 2 schools actually have focused on changing regimes of capitalism, across time, and but they never openly or directly link the regime story with the inequality story. So that's something that we can do. So what exactly is a regime? Just to give you an example, what emerged after 1940s in the US or UK until about 1970s, a broad welfare state kind of regime where there was a contained conflict between capital and labor. There was almost an accord where productivity gains would be distributed between capital and labor, with a good welfare state which creates a good fallback position for workers. That's one kind of regime. And then you see the system falling into a crisis by the late 60s, early 70s, heightened by oil shocks in the early 70s. Then you see the regime being dismantled in the mid to late 70s. By early 80s, you begin to see the emergence of a completely different regime of capitalism. So capitalism temporarily keeps changing, depending on what kind of crisis it is actually encountering. New institutions come into place, and these new institutions, you could actually read some of the literature of regulation school or social structures of accumulation to focus on the particular institutions that came into being at different points in time in response to certain crises that the system faces. So that is broadly the idea of a regime, that it's basically the institutional framework through which processes of accumulation happen and the overall reproduction of the economic system happens. So my claim is that if you take the last 150 years or so, the global capitalist system has been oscillating between profitability crisis and effective demand crisis. This is a paper that I also sent you earlier. It's there in your folder. There is a long period in the late 19th century, almost 20-year period, when there was a profitability crisis. Then you had the Great Depression. Then you have the 60s, 70s profitability crisis. Then you have the 2008 crisis. So every 30-40 years, the system goes through a fairly deep crisis, and then new institutions begin to emerge to address the particular crisis. And what profitability crises do is basically capital becomes capital finds it hard to create enough profitability in the system. So as a result, a profitability crisis typically leads to a regime that tends to increase profits one way or the other. And one of the ways in which profits can be increased is by squeezing workers' wages, and this tends to typically cause increases in inequality. And this is something that you see in the period before Great Depression, 1920s. You also see the same thing in the period between 1980s, between 1980s and 2008. So a system that responds to a regime that comes into being, responding to a profitability crisis, tends to cause an increase in inequality. And if there is an effective demand kind of a crisis, where enough is being produced, there are profits in the system, but the commodities that are produced are not being sold effectively. This sort of a crisis tends to typically lead to greater redistributions of income. So that is precisely what how the system responded. In the post 1930s, 1940s, when the welfare state was created, certain kinds of demand management policies were taken up by different states and so forth. If we look at, if we want to understand it in a simple way, Marx talks about, circuit of capital, where, a capitalist, he talks about it in the micro context, in the context of an individual capitalist. An individual capitalist starts with, let's say, a certain amount of money, capital M, buys, raw materials and, machinery and, labor power, the ability to perform labor from the labor market, and then puts these to work in a process of production. So the first C is basically what the capitalist initially buys from the market, and then there is a process of production, and a new commodity C prime is produced, and then the C prime is actually it has to be sold in the market, for another amount of money M prime, and that's what the capitalist gets. And the difference between M prime and M is actually the profit or the surplus that the capitalist produces. Now, the profitability crisis that I briefly talked about is the crisis that could happen between M and C prime. Basically, enough profit is not being created in the system. Whether it is increases in the price of raw materials, increases in the price of the price at which labor power is bought, or in the process of production somewhere, capitalist is not able to extract enough effort from the workers. It could lead to a profitability crisis. And then once a commodity is produced, the other kind of crisis, let's say enough profit is already being created, in the process of production, enough profit is being embodied in the new commodity that is being produced. It still has to be sold, right? So it has to be sold to a large market, and if there are not enough people who have the purchasing power to buy these commodities, then you have what Marx calls as a realization crisis, or an underconsumption crisis, or what Keynes calls as an effective demand crisis, right? So there are these two kinds of crises. This is how one can understand it simply. And history of the last 150 years. So this is, this is where the four deep crises are shown. 1873 to 1896. There's a profitability crisis, and I talk about it in the paper that I sent to all of you. The Great Depression is basically an effective demand crisis. And then the stagflation, as economists have called it, of 1970s is a profitability crisis again. And then the Great Recession of 2008, or the financial crisis as we call it, is again a dormant effective demand crisis, which came with a financial crisis too, as Great Depression, late 1920s. So the claim here is, when the system addresses a profitability crisis, so from M to C prime, let's say, one of the reasons why there's a profitability crisis is because workers, they have a fallback position, they have a good welfare state, or the union strength is quite high at a particular point in time. The response, to a profitability crisis would be, well, dismantle the welfare state, reduce the fallback position, or attack workers' organizations or unions. And this is precisely what happened when the profitability crisis of 1970s emerged. If you look at Margaret Thatcherism in Britain, or Ronald Reagan's policies in the US, or policies that were then exported to various countries across the world, you actually see various responses that address the systemic need at that point in time, which is to restore profitability, right? And but then when you address the profitability crisis, what happens is, you actually have to redistribute income in favor of the rich. That would cause rises in inequality. But then when inequality begins to rise and incomes are redistributed to the rich, it has typically led, if you look at this particular pattern of oscillation, it has typically led to a problem with effective demand. Because you've redistributed income to the rich, but who is going to purchase all the commodities? You are making profits as a capitalist class, but who will you sell these goods to? So this is the typical oscillation that the system has fallen into. I'm not saying that this pattern would continue eternally, but this is the pattern that would be somewhat coherent. If you want to make sense of what happened in the last 150 years. And then you also look at inequality patterns. So what, I'll come back to this, but probably what Kuznets caught, in his inverted U hypothesis is two regimes of capitalism which address, two systemic needs of, different kinds of crises. This is just to sort of give you a picture, a graph of, the three crises, and we know that the fourth crisis, it happened during our conscious period. So let me conclude. What does the Asian experience actually teach us? I think the first point, as I see it, is that inequality rises in the early development, early capitalist kind of development in the West, whereas in Asian countries it's not clear. For instance, if you look at the Japanese case, but typically, if you look at the period after 1950s as the period of capitalist development of most of these economies, typically it declines. The second point is, while Asian economies were experiencing these patterns of inequality, they were not isolated. I think most countries across the world were also experiencing the same patterns. That's why I showed you the US and UK inequality patterns. And so this, the third point follows. Post 1980s, the rise in inequality in the Asian economies corresponds to rise in inequality across most nations in the world. And here, we need to, if you want to make sense of this, you need to bring the local political economy processes and the global political economy processes and a combination of the two. And the crucial insight about the local political economy processes is that, when these economies were going through a progressive regime, let's say between 50s and 70s, they also at the same time consolidated a particular economic class or capitalist class or a political class that then brought about through its agency significant changes in the overall economic structure as they grew stronger, as they consolidated themselves. On the other hand, you actually see these oscillating regimes or regimes that came into being in response to the oscillating crises, and so the global political economy story ties in with the local political economy story. So for instance, Suresh in the presentation in the afternoon made a throwaway remark, which is, in South Africa, let's say, the democratization process happened not during the neoliberal period, but let's say during some other period, the impact on inequality might have been extremely different. I think the larger regime, probably mattered. The fact that they were already, there was a larger global neoliberal economy in place. The process of democratization, led to a certain kind of inequality pattern emerging in a democratic South Africa. And the link, so one link is established through, the local classes that consolidated, the local class structures that actually form. The other link is, multilateral institutions help. Whenever different countries go through crises, you actually the multilateral institutions are asked for credit, IMF or World Bank, and so they go in with a certain set of policy packages. That's how the regime actually gets implemented in different countries. This is a point that we already discussed. The global regimes of 1950 to 80, the broad welfare state, Keynesian regime, what some people have called as the golden age of capitalism, and post 1980, the neoliberal regime, coincided with changes in